Welcome to Unspoken and a new two-part series on gender inequality and gender-based violence, where we're focusing specifically on the treatment of women by men. Our panelists are Danny Musagi, who was a long-time member at St. James Church and is now the director of Arise.
I work on the Cape Flats, so I see it. You know, women are walking around with bruises.
Karen Falkner, also long-time member at St. James, art teacher and advocate for human rights.
When someone is violated, the healing of that can be a lifetime.
And Fundiswa Yuba, actively involved in Red Post Church and also an HR consultant.
You're going to have people who are either passively allowing gender-based violence to continue or who are actively perpetrating gender-based violence.
Ladies, thank you so much for being here. I've recently watched the Jeff Epstein Filthy Rich series and also Athlete A documentary, both on Netflix, both extremely disturbing. So these shows document sexual crimes perpetrated by men against women and more often than not young women. And usually the authorities or people close to these perpetrators either turn a blind eye or they just don't mete out severe enough punishment. These are both extreme cases, like where it became very public and like the whole world knows about it. But it's not just like a global problem. Here in South Africa, we have some of the highest rates of crimes against women in the world. So, yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to hand it over to you. Just speak about gender inequality in our country and in the world, and then specifically gender-based violence, which is very prevalent in our country. So, Fundi, can you please get us going?
Thank you for that, Nikki. It's such a heavy and nuanced and complex topic to speak about because first and foremost, the language around gender-based violence has only been around probably for the last 10 years. So a lot of us are also just trying to understand, okay, we're hearing GBV, but what does it mean? And I'm going to paraphrase and the ladies will also help me, but it is violence against a particular individual based on their gender. And specifically to what we're talking about, it is violence against women, whether it is physical, emotional, spiritual. It also includes the exclusion or access to things like education, health, that male counterparts would be able to enjoy, but because you're a girl or a female, you cannot participate in that. So with that understanding, you then begin to think, okay, this is slightly broader than sexual abuse. It's a bit bigger than that. And then for South Africa specifically, my question then always starts with, why is gender-based violence so prevalent in our society? What makes South Africa and South Africans so violent? Where does that come from for us to end up where we are?
I would agree. You know, gender-based violence, I think, is so multifaceted. It's not just, I know we're talking for an hour here, but I mean, we could literally talk for hours around the issue of GBV. And I think it is important to understand that GBV and the violence in our country, we need to look at our past. You're looking at systemic issues in our country that is filtrated into our families, into the way we bring up our children, and especially how we bring up our boys and our men to develop that empathy and that understanding of their feelings so that they're able to cope in a healthy manner instead of taking on their frustration and their anger, which comes out in violence and aggression in various forms, as you said. But GBV in our country is actually a pandemic. So right now we're in COVID-19, but really GBV was our first pandemic before COVID-19. And the truth is, at the moment, what we're doing is we're putting the Band-Aid on the issue, but we need to get to the root causes. Why are men, specifically men, taking out their anger and their rage on women and on children? And we're seeing the consequences in our communities and in our families.
And I think it's healthy to rewind a bit and look at the history of our country. So the three top countries that have the worst stats for gender-based violence are all countries that were colonized, which I find really interesting. So if we look at the fact that South Africa was colonized, birthed and enforced in violence and brutality, and then apartheid on top of that, and particularly in the Western Cape we have slavery, which all contributes towards the psyche of the way South Africans think about one another, the way they think about problem solving. And particularly if we think about Women's Day, that's fascinating. The Women's Day March in 1956 was primarily a protest against women, black women carrying passes. But in their sharing of their demands with, well, not sharing, their handing over of demands to the then Prime Minister, which was J.G. Strydom, there were two that were highlighted the fact that this pass law was going to mean that women were particularly targeted with violence. So, and in terms of the police were going to target women particularly. So I find it fascinating that we've got this history that is the foundation of the way we think and act, and it just has continued to work out. And that's part of understanding gender-based violence. I know we're uncomfortable with always going back to the past, but the past is present.
Yeah, so I think it is important that we go in our past, because there's one thing that I've learned in the work that I've done is generational trauma. That actually, even though someone has experienced a single trauma, if we look in their past and their family, people actually carry on the generational trauma. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing our past carrying into our future. And so we need to learn, how do we break the cycles in terms of how we parent, in terms of how we think, becoming more self-aware of how do I cope with my anger, what do I think about men, what do I think about women, and so really that is where we get to the crux, the root of the causes in terms of GBV, is going, what is the generational trauma, because we have to acknowledge it, and once we acknowledge it, then we can go, what is the healing, and once we get to the healing, it's how we teach, and we continue breaking those cycles into our future.
I think one thing that also just emanates from looking at our history as a country is the breaking down of the primary component that builds up society, and that's the family. So one of the big things that the history of South Africa did was to fragment families through a migrant labor system where you would have wives and children getting left behind and fathers going off to work in the big urban areas. So to a large extent, we don't have whole and cohesive family units. And that also leads to exacerbating the generational trauma of, so what does healthy male energy look like? What does a healthy expression of male frustration, disappointment, and anger, how does it play itself out? A lot of people are growing up in homes where they're just not exposed to that. They're not exposed in their homes, they're not exposed in their extended families, and they're not exposed in their communities. And so we sit then with a group of people who are also carrying their own trauma, but then are inflicting trauma and regaining their power in very violent acts against women and children in South Africa.
I was just going to add, you didn't mention aggression. So, I mean, boys like to play fight. And if you don't have a guy there to show you what the limits are, it's like you can play fight, but there's, you don't go past a certain point where you can actually hurt each other, And if that's suppressed also, if they don't have the opportunity to play fight, then it does come out, as you say, when they're older, it plays out in a more violent way because they don't know what the limits are.
Yeah, and I think we see it in our systems, so in terms of what are our beliefs, what are our values, and I think this is where the church plays a vital role. So what are we teaching, what our men are supposed to be, what a woman is supposed to be, and that becomes part of our values and our beliefs, which goes into the social norms. So you saying boys, most boys play fights, is that a belief that we just know, or is it true? These are the questions we need to ask ourselves, and then we see that play out in terms of our social norms. So what we're seeing is that men go, well, I am the head of the household. So what does that mean for my wife? What does that mean for my children? And so what you find is even in the state of our country where a lot of our men are unemployed and young men unemployed, you're finding them feeling lonely, having fear, not being able to be that breadwinner, and that causes disempowerment. Which comes with trauma. And we know with trauma, if we're not coping with our feelings, that internalizes and becomes rage, and that becomes anger, and that's what comes out in aggression. And so when we look at gender-based violence, we can't just say, well, it's someone who's been raped or someone who's been beaten. What it starts out is also, it starts out with verbal abuse. How we talk to people is how we see people, and what's going on in our hearts. And then it's the psychological trauma. The more I can keep you down, you're going to obey me. And then when you speak up, then I'm going to tell you and show you how to keep you in control. Because at least I can be in control of this person in my life. Can't control if I'm employed, can't control about the money coming in, but I can control you. And so that is what we're speaking into when we speak to men, when we speak about the inequality and how we teach our women that it's okay to be fierce, to talk up, to be strong, to be confident, to speak out of what's happening in the home. And so when I say in terms of the family, the church plays a big role. And so it is a controversial statement, but it's going, what are we teaching our men, and men who are in power, who are role models to other men, of how they speak about women and how they treat other women.
And also, I think, Danny, to just tag on to that, not only just the men in the body of Christ, but also the spaces that women can occupy and how women can show up in the church. Because if young boys are seeing a particular narrative of what it means to be a godly man, and this is what a godly woman looks like, it then shapes and provides the foundation of how they socialize with their sisters in the body of Christ, how they then enter into adult relationships, the husbands and fathers and bosses that they then become. So it's very important in this conversation that we explore, one, in this church family, how men present themselves and show up, and also how women present themselves and show up in the body, and what that then communicates to everyone else watching and a part of this family.
Yeah, I'm going to do the rewind to the history bit again, because I think a missing part of this conversation is unpacking patriarchy and how that plays itself out in society, and particularly in the church, and unpacking what we understand as biblical leadership, as opposed to what we've understood from our past, where power has rested with men, and that leads to expectations that men have of themselves, that women have of men, and it's all this confusion around, and stereotypes of what Danny and Fundi were saying about how we expect men and women to be, boys and girls. So even your example, Nikki, of the stick fighting thing, I thought, so for me, I'm a mom of 4 sons, so for me in that moment, that is teaching them, being physical and that, it's not really about that, it's the no. There's a point when someone says no, that is no. And I think we don't understand that is really powerful, and it's a really important thing for boys to learn. Sorry, I'm digressing a bit.
No,
here.
I think it's really important. So, I mean, I also have 2 boys, and I think the importance for us in our home is teaching them about their feelings, so becoming emotionally literate. So you're angry and you feel like punching your brother. I know you do. Yeah. But how are you feeling? What are the other choices? So even my 3-year-old, he gets very angry and he screams. And I go, what else can you do? Because your brother's not sharing with you now. And I know you want to hit him. So what else can you do? And he can tell me, I can walk away. I can tell a grown-up, or I choose something else to play with. Great. And in that way, what we're trying to do is, if you understand your emotions, you also understand the choices that comes with your feelings.
But I think then what's foundational in what you're highlighting, Danny, is there's also a need for the parents to be present in those conversations. So you can't be having conversations and training around limits and boundaries around when someone says no, this is what no looks like, or these are your feelings. What are you feeling at this moment? Why are you feeling it? And what options do you have available to you? You can't impart that and train a child on how he should become if you also have not worked through those things. And I think that's why I think we keep hopping on around the fact of we all come from a traumatic history and background in South Africa, and it has shaped a lot of us in particular ways. And we, first and foremost, as parents, as leaders, as people who are older, need to do the work around ourselves, our feelings, and how we have been shaped by the culture and the society that we come in from, before we can then say, okay, how do we then try and alter the course for the next generation? Because it's very easy and quick for us to go into fixing mode. Okay, I'm going to just fix my daughter. But actually, what work have I done as Ufundiswa in how I show up in spaces so that I do not further perpetuate the issues that we are now facing in our society?
Can I just take us in a slightly different direction? I think we might have missed out on some of what the happenings are, what like we're just talking about how we can sort of remedy things. But I think we need to touch on the seriousness of what's actually going on in our country. I know we're in the top 3 in the world, like you mentioned.
I think we are, yeah.
So what is that? What is actually happening? I mean, I know just down the road from our church, something terrible happened, and that's just one case of way too many. So
I love that question because I think it was about a year. Did that thing happen with Uyaneni? Was it a year or two years ago? And at that point in our church, we had a Sunday, which I like to call it a Sunday of acknowledgement and lament. And some women and men were invited to share their thoughts on our stage. And it was very interesting to listen to the women. So they said one of 3 things. They either said #MeToo, or they said enough is enough, like a cry of anger or frustration into the void. Or they said, I'm tired of feeling afraid. And I think in those 3 voices is the truth, the uncomfortable truth, that women in South Africa, anyone, anytime, anywhere, in your home, outside of your home, no matter how old you are, no matter how young you are, can be, have been, and could be a victim of some kind of gender-based violence.
Yeah, I mean, you're looking at 3 women sitting here, and the stats show 1 in 3 women will be raped in her lifetime. And so we need to look at the context of that, what we're looking at. 1 in 6 women experience violence in their lifetime by a loving partner that they know. Last year in the Western Cape alone, we had 936 children who have been killed, raped, and murdered in the Western Cape alone. And so, yes, we have a problem. And so I love the question because we need to understand the context, and the numbers speaks volumes of what's happening on the ground in our homes. And GBV isn't just a poor problem thing. It's not just a black person thing. It's everyone's problem. It happens, doesn't matter what race, what class you're in, it affects every single person. But what we've, as a society, is that in our household, we don't talk about what happens in our household. And so the climate of keeping secrets is what we've generated over and over again. And so children are not speaking out, women are not speaking out. We don't have support systems, and so for me, I work on the Cape Flats, so I see it. Women are walking around with bruises, or they're turning into drugs or alcohol to cope. But I have friends in private practice, and they're seeing moms in Constantia, Bishop's Court, getting in onto TIC, suicidal, antidepressants, anxiety, because they're experiencing violence, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, economic abuse, where the husband's earning massive incomes and they are isolated at home, and the husband gets to tell them what they can spend. Here's 2,000 Rand for you for the month. You know, those kind of things is the power that men hold over women. And we don't have that support system where women can go and go, this is what's happening to me. Because either we're normalizing that behavior, oh, you're so lucky you live in a mansion. What do you have to complain about? You know, you married. You should be happy that you married. And I'm very sensitive on that topic because as women, it's like this, it's ingrained into us that men make us better. And that being a single woman, oh, shame, I feel sorry for you. What is that all about? And my friends all know, it's like, what is that all about? You know, having a husband is great. I love my husband, but I don't need him. I
Doesn't
want him in
define
my
you.
life, but I don't need my husband to be the woman that I am today.
But I think it goes back to, I think, two things then. One, Nikki's question around what's happening on the ground. What's happening on the ground is we're going to have people watching us. And of those people watching us, it will either be someone who's saying #MeToo as something that's happened in my past. Someone is going to be saying me now as it's something that I'm living through. And then you're going to have people who are either passively allowing gender-based violence to continue or who are actively perpetrating gender-based violence in their homes and in their communities. And I'm saying this specifically because when we talk about the body of Christ, we always want to assume these are the world's problems. No. There are people who are going to be watching, a part of our community, who fall into the various categories that I've mentioned. Some I haven't even mentioned.
The point that I think I want to hone in on is it's those people who are watching but think that, you know, it's not quite my thing. You know what I mean? It's like there's a nonchalance about it, and it's not me, or it's not that. Like, I'm not doing it myself as a guy specifically. You know, that's the other side of it. Like, a lot of guys might be watching and thinking, you know what? It's just women complaining again. You know, and like, yeah, I think for the first time, I actually took action a couple of weeks ago with my friend passed on something that somebody had sent to him, and I was like, you know, this actually isn't all right. You know, normally I'll just like send a LOL, you know, to be respectful.
Awkward, yeah.
Even though it's awkward, but I think on this occasion I was like, bruh, you got 2 daughters. You know, you can't send stuff like this. And I think like that was in the lead up to this episode. I think there's been a shift in my mind, in my approach to it, and I think that I've been like fast asleep for a very long time, even though I don't think I was necessarily out there doing the worst things. But I think like you're saying, the silence, not acting, not taking a stand, you know, that's part of the problem, and it's a big part of the problem.
Completely. And when you talk about gender-based violence, you have to talk about gender inequality. Yes. So for the men who's watching this program, I want to go take a little bit of a step back and maybe look in your work environment and go, how are women treated in your work environment? Who are the CEOs? Who are the execs? Are women given a chance? How do they talk about women when you're having beers after work? You know, it's those jokes, it's those insensitivities, and you go, you're being too sensitive. But it's that kind of thinking that starts going, well, actually, women are not equal to men. You know, I've worked in the NGO space, I've worked in corporate space, and I've been told by a man in corporate space, is this a skill you can learn, or do you have the talent? And you know, you've got to kind of sit back and go, well, it's a skill, I can learn it. But the moment you speak up, and you then get a bad name as a woman. You know, you're too feisty, you're a feminist. Oh my goodness,
or
such
you're
a
the
bad
angry
word.
woman.
Yeah.
You're the angry woman. Yeah.
That's
the angry,
challenge.
Too loud, turn it down.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think we would all have those kinds of examples where we've had experiences. So I find it encouraging when you sit there, Nikki, and say, I've had this dawning, because I think particularly in the church, there's this attitude that men seem to have that, oh, it's just that ungodly lot over there that are part of it. But actually, I think men need to start seeing that it's an everybody problem. So part of the problem is that men perpetuate this, and everyone is part of the solution. And so that's super encouraging. And your example is not a small example, it's a big example, because it's the same as being a white person speaking on issues of race. I can speak to white people about that in a particular way. I have an opportunity, I have a voice, and white people will listen to me because it just works like that. And it's exactly the same for men, to seize that opportunity and to see that there's a great power in men relationships, and I'm using power in a positive way, that you can really change that narrative where men meet together on hockey WhatsApp groups or your neighborly, whatever that is. And it's not just those, the passing on of porn, that's the obvious one, but it would be all kinds of the way Danny was speaking about, the way men speak about women, the jokes that are passed on, that kind of thing. And I think if we step even a little bit back into spaces where men are, and this is a tricky one, where women have joined that space. So if we're thinking of patriarchy and we're thinking of spaces that were generally always men's spaces, and now you've invited and women are able to join those spaces. Unfortunately, what happens is that those spaces still remain men's spaces. The rules of engagement are the way men have designed them to be. And so women step into those spaces on the back foot. And I think particularly in the church, that is something that plays out. I can give some examples if you need to know. So for example, on WhatsApp groups, the men define the rules of engagement on a WhatsApp group. The men are the ones that generally speak, women are generally silent. One even went so far as to, and I know we don't want noisy WhatsApp groups, one went as far as to say, we don't want those, Bible verse things. And I was like, gee, I mean, that is what women often do. They'll post Bible verse. So you're silenced because the space is a man's space and the rules of engagement are defined by men. And I think that there's a lot of rethinking that we need to do in the church and out of the church, in places where women are going for the first time.
I think it's considering it's so funny how things just link to each other, but it's considering what inclusivity looks like. And I think if we look at the church, we are called to be the body of Christ. So the body of Christ, and just look at our physiology, we've got so many different parts of our bodies. You can't necessarily have a body that's just the nose. It's going to be an ineffective and inefficient body. But what we then have is, if there's an overemphasis of male energy, male way of being and doing things, a male-driven message, you have that in the church. You have a nose. The rest of the church is not being heard. It's not participating. It is not a healthy, functioning body, because there are aspects of the body that are just not playing their part. So how does that play itself out? If we have someone that has been attacked, if someone has been raped or abused and violated, who do they feel most comfortable, and let's say it's a woman, to go and speak to? If that crime has been done by another man, is there someone who looks and sounds like me that I feel comfortable enough that I will get empathy from that person? That's the one thing. Secondly, when we are talking around female issues, where's the female voice coming forward? Because there are just certain things that I will know about being a parent that my husband won't know. He's just incapable of knowing those things in his maleness. And there are things I will never know about being a man because I'm a woman. And that is the beauty of saying we are created equal, but we're different. And to appreciate those differences. And instead of saying, if Nikki is present, he's taking something away from me, it's for me to say, Nikki's here, Nikki is good at this. Fundi, you can do this. And we bring our strengths and our giftings and our talents for the good of the body. So I think the challenge that we have, and just going back to the numbers within the church, if we are saying 1 in 3 women have experienced some form of abuse in their life, when we are sitting in Sunday services, how is that speaking to us? how is it giving us the boldness to also go and be amongst other women and stand up and say, me too. This is the pain that I have felt. This is the shame that I have been carrying, but this is how Christ has liberated me. If we do not have those opportunities, the church becomes this beautiful space, but that cannot speak into a broken and dying world, because our message is irrelevant to what people are living and experiencing. And the truth of the matter is, gender-based violence is not a women-only problem. You might not know about it in your personal life, but it could be that you're married to someone who's experienced something, but they're not comfortable to talk about it. Not because you're a bad person, but because they must still work through some stuff. You could be a parent and things are happening to your kids and you're not aware. The challenge a lot with, and I'm just going to speak to molestation, people who molest children are people who have access. And so that means it's people who are close to me. It's a relative, it's a sports coach. It's someone who is trusted by me. There's a sense and a form of authority. Children learn very early on to trust what they're being told without questioning. So if someone is telling me that it is okay for these sexual acts to happen, I'm going to accept and believe it. And if they tell me that, don't tell your mom and dad, and I see my mom and dad laughing with that person, then it seems like my mom and dad are okay with what's happening. It's okay. And so you walk away with a child who has a distorted sense of who they are, what their worth is. They have a distorted sense of understanding sexuality. And that child is broken. And that is where the enemy would like them to stay. But if the church embraces the diversity of experiences, the diversity of people within the body of the church, there will be someone who can speak into that broken child, even if that broken child is showing up as a 40-year-old woman.
Because we understand that that is the experience of women at church, Fundi. So we're making a safe space for that. You know, it's not about we want to parade our pain. It's just that you want a safe space for that.
To communicate and also to be able to speak truth into certain things, because I'm saying the message communicated is a distorted and a false message, but you've been walking around with that. So if you're sitting with other people, some people have journeyed further, they've done a bit of work, they can speak truth into that lie that you have been told. And then healing can take place, restoration can take place.
So a beautiful thing, a friend of mine has written 40 tips for men. So he's a man, he's written 40 tips for men. And he's a great voice for all sorts of things. Interestingly enough, when he posts the stuff on Facebook and I repost it, mainly women like what he's posted, which is fascinating. But in there, he speaks about one of the things that men can learn, which is to listen with empathy and listen with care and humility. And I think that you just in the conversation that you were having, that if we're able to, so it's not that you want to share everyone's deep, dark stuff that's happened, but if in the relationships that we have with women, that men can ask some, like, what is it like to be a woman? And so that there's real listening and a development of empathy of the issues that women are experiencing. And so that once again, there's a space where we can be a community that supports people who are broken by a variety of gender-based violence things. And I think one of the things that's worth saying is that when someone is violated continuously or whatever the case may be, that the healing of that can be a lifetime, a journey of lifetime of healing. And yeah, I think that the church can play a part in being patient with that healing, a real healthy journeying, and women can play that with one another. But if there's not that space to share those stories or to know that it's okay to say these things happened to me and that you're not stigmatized as that broken human being, that broken woman with that, because there's so much shame around gender-based violence. If you are raped or whatever the case may be, or you're experiencing domestic abuse, there's shame attached to that, deep, deep shame. And I think that part of having a safe space in these kinds of conversations within a church community would mean that we understand that a lot of women bring that backpack of that shame. They carry it with them. It's part of who they are.
Yeah, And I think that's why male leadership within the church is vital. What does that male leadership look like? You know, if men in the church is always the authoritative figure, is that a safe space for me as a woman who've experienced abuse? Do I want to go there? You know, how do we create those safe spaces? It's relationship. And so we don't need representation. The same thing with race. You know, it's no point of appointing a black pastor because we need a representation. It's about transformation. Yeah. So when we talk about transformation, what does those relationships look like? So when I hire a black male to be a pastor, what kind of relationship does he have with the white male person in authority? The same with women. What is the role that women have in the church? Now I know it's a little bit controversial, but what is the role of women in the church? Are we only for women's ministry and only for children's workers? Is that all we good for? I would say no. I would say there's more that we can bring to the party so that our women and our family and our men can see women as created equal, as in the image of God. You know, as in the secular world, we have women who are presidents, great surgeons, great teachers. But in the church, what are we saying? That women are only good at looking after children and other women? I think that is a question we need to start asking ourselves. What is biblical teaching and what is traditional teaching? And how do we not confuse the two?
And I think just an awareness that in everything that we do as people, and I know we love to believe that we are these logical great reasoners, but we are biased to the core. And in every situation and setting, we bring our bias and we bring our cultural lenses into everything that we do. So if I read a particular passage in the Bible, there's certain sensitivities that I will have that I will pick up. Karen will read and she'll pick something else up. Danny will read and you will read. So if we have an awareness of that, it begins to, I think, just ease us up into knowing that, okay, I don't have to be perfect in everything. I see things in this particular manner. Let me be open enough to be able to speak to the next person to see where they're coming from. So that in our reading of the Word of God, we begin to say, okay, God's Word says this. Fundi is a black female, grew up in the Eastern Cape. What is Fundi bringing into that text in her reading of the text? And I think that's critical when we start having conversations around the role of women in the church. Because our understanding of maybe what Christ compels us to do might also be shaped by our culture and the way we've been raised and the way we've seen things happening. I just think something Karen also spoke about, that just in reflecting on Scott's message around the sinful woman. It's such a powerful passage, one, because you just see this woman that we're told she's done something of notoriety. She could be a prostitute. The text doesn't let us know, but she is known to this people, and whatever she's known for is not positive. And here she is standing at the door of this religious leader. What bravery in standing at that door to come to this dinner so that she could see Christ. What compels her to stand at that door to say, I know I'm not wanted, I'm not accepted in this space, but I'm going to come because what Jesus is offering calls me and compels me to be here. And I think if we then look at how does Christ receive her, we can then start having a conversation around how should we then be receiving women in the church.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I want to pivot a bit now. So I just want to look at like some of the key differences in how the world would tackle like the dismantling of this issue that we're having versus what the church is doing. And like, is there some crossover between the two? I know the two of us spoke about it a bit on our 55-minute call or something in the lead up to this. And like I was saying, like you want to do something, But at the same time, as a Christian man, I don't want to be marching with the feminists necessarily, you know, but I don't want women to be harmed anymore. So what do I actually do? You know what I mean? So yeah, is there some crossover? What is the world doing? What are we doing as a church, you know, as Christians?
So, if I can start, one of the things I love about our country is our very carefully thought out constitution. It is a work of art, a beautiful document, and enshrined in it is every human being, no matter whether they are a man or a woman's humanity, and the strong commitment to affirming, upholding, making space for men and women as equal beings. And so I'm very encouraged whenever I hear people speak about our constitution. And this week I listened to Tuli Madansela speaking about and affirming again that we have a beautiful constitution that affirms women in their equality with men. And so when we use language like what in the world, that kind of language, I think for me, I struggle with that language because it's, sorry, Nikki.
No,
it's
you're
just
right.
like we tend to have this idea that what we're doing in the church is something that's working, and the outside the church in the world is a mess. But so that's why I wanted to start with our constitution, because I think the working out of it in society, as Danny mentioned earlier on, there's a lot of positive stuff happening. You know, we have women judges, we've had women speakers of the House, we've got mayors and blah 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 in education and medicine. There's all kinds of exciting things happening where there's a shift, and the reason why we hang there is because in the structures, if we really believe that men and women are equal, we'll see that playing out in the structures of our country, which we are seeing, and that shifts the narrative. If we are in relationship at work, if we're having this equality working out in relationships at work, then you get to experience one another as emotional beings. Intellectual respect is built in those relationships in the workplace, and I think that then filters out into how we do life as men and women. I know you're talking about the differences with the church and the world, so I'm sure someone else can pick up on that.
I will say something. I think as a church, in terms of the institution, and we look at the world, the secular world, I do think the secular world has done better than our church as an institution. And exactly what Karen was saying in terms of our constitution, about programs out there for women, for victims and perpetrators. And I think the church needs to be better in terms of how, not only how they treat women, but how they speak out to other perpetrators and to men. I think we need to call out men to do better for women in the church. We also need to create that safe space, as Fundi says, for women who have definitely experienced some type of abuse or violence in their lifetime or currently. And so what does that look like? And I think in terms of that healing, especially for women, I think how men interact with women is so healing. You know, for a man to show empathy, for a man to treat you as equal, that is healing in itself. And so I think men need to understand that, yes, you do have great power, and with great power comes responsibility. But really, you've got to own that and go, let's look at our church today. What can we do better? And you're not going to have the answer, so you need to go talk to women. And so women in your community go, actually, this is what we need. It's like going into any community. We don't go into communities and go, yes, I know exactly what you need. No. You talk to people, go, what is the issues? What are the problems? How are you viewing this? And women will talk. Ask them the questions, and they will tell you what they're missing within the church. And then come up with an action plan involving women in order for the programs or the services, whatever experiences women have, to be better. And that's what we need. And yeah, I think it's just important to look, it's in one way we need to be in partnership with wonderful organizations out there. If I look at the Western Cape alone, I think about Rape Crisis. I know Karen and I spoke about them. That is an organization I refer almost any woman that's experienced rape to go there, because they are excellent at what they do. And we don't have the answers to everything as a church. You know, we can pray, we can talk about God, and yes, God is there. But in terms of that healing and that mental health, there are experts that are doing the work, and we need to call them and work with them in partnership so that our services are stronger together. And so, yes, I'm calling for the church to do better for women and children that are experiencing abuse today. And that starts with the men in power.
Do you think, like, part of the reason why we're behind the world or the secular world on this is because we are not acting out the word enough? Just, I mean, if you look at Mervin's series on identity, I mean, it's right there in Genesis already. So it's not like, and I was chatting to Philip van Blurk, who's a good friend of mine, and like the Bible's radical throughout. You know what I mean? It's always been revolutionary, like, and yeah, I think like we conservative, you know. So yeah.
I think it's when you're talking about what the difference is in the world and the church and where we are. So the world says male, female, we're the same. So equal pay, everything must be the same. And then if you come into a more conservative Christian space that says we are created equal before God and we've got different roles to fulfill. Happy to be there with you. Where it gets a bit muddy is I think we don't then take God's word seriously enough to do the practical application of what it means to be equal before God. And how does that play itself out? Your views, your hurts, who you are as a person has dignity and weight before God. So do I. And then how does that play itself out in how we have our services, in how we communicate, who gets to speak, who's invited where are the decisions being made and taken, and who is in the room when those decisions are being made and taken. So if we are saying that we are created equal, but decisions are about how things are going forward, there are 7 men and 1 woman. It's the exact same thing that would be happening in the world. So if we take seriously enough the word of God that says we are created equal, let us see that bearing fruit in how we act. And I want to be controversial in saying this, that then maybe if our actions aren't reflecting that, the root of the problem is we never took God seriously at his word in the first place.
Yeah, and for me, that equality that is reflected in Genesis right at the beginning is so beautiful, because as a woman, I'm an image bearer. I don't have a different image. You know, if we think about all the weirdnesses that we experience, I don't have a different image based on my biology to a man. It's exactly the same. So I'm able to reflect God's image the same as a man is able to. And God also holds me accountable for myself as a woman. I'm not held accountable through a man, an earthly man. I'm held accountable as a woman before him. And he died for me. I can come to him as a woman. So there's all this beautiful affirmation of equality. And I agree 100% with Fundi. I think there's a disconnect between our preaching and understanding of that equality. So we'll preach it and it's loud and clear and we've got it. But what does that look like in the way we live our relationships out? And one of the things I find quite fascinating is that we often jump to the marriage relationship in expanding and exploring that. And I would want to pause and let's just leave that, and that's a separate conversation, but let's talk about equality, a man to women in the church. So let's not jump to the marriage example. Let's just hang in that space, because there's so many men to women relationships in the church. And so what does that look like if we really believe that men and women are created equally before the Lord? And that's what he's done. What does that look like? And that's a lot of the conversation we've been having, is that I think there is a disconnect. So we say it, but that's not our experience. And this week, in preparing for this, I thought, it's all very well that I have all these ideas. And Danny and Fundi and I have been chatting, but I did a little bit of chatting with some younger Christians and some other Christian women, like really asking some honest, hard questions. And one, it's not the story I want to tell you. She told me a story, and it's a story that one could hear in any church really around the world, and how this played out in this notion of inequality. And when I asked her, how did that make you feel, that thing that happened? She used 2 words. She said, I was voiceless and I was crushed. And I think it might be worth just holding those 2 words, because I suspect there are a lot of women, because we're not living out this belief of equality in practice, that feel and experience. So I'm not saying leadership have done that. I'm saying in relationships in the church, where at times, and that has been my experience as a Christian woman, I tend to be a strong, opinionated person, and I share that, and that hasn't always gone down well. I felt silenced, I've been spoken over, and so there's a myriad of those kinds of voicelessness and crushings that have been experienced by women, because we're not taking that beautiful equality seriously.
We're not listening.
And it's all that unconscious bias as well, you know. Even though we've been taught men are created equal, but we have different roles. Okay, I'm with you on that, as Fundi is. But why are those roles treated inferior? To tell me as a woman my role is to be the nurturer. Why can't men be the nurturer? In fact, that's more powerful for my sons to see their father being a nurturer within the home. So the Bible is radical. You know, how do we serve other people? How do we serve everyone? And not just people of the same class, people who live 15 minutes down the road from us in poverty. It is so important that we're able to be in relationship, because that is the gospel. It's in relationship with each other, and that's how we change people. In the work that I do on the Cape Flats, that's how we see people. We treat everyone as equal. If you come from Bishop Lavis to Bishop's Court, you get the same service. And we walk a journey with that family, because we know that is the change that's going to happen. It's not, oh, here's a skill, this is how you become a better parent. It's going, I hear you, I validate you, and I value you. And let's walk that journey together. And that's essentially what women are asking. You know, we are saying in the church, treat us as equal. If you say I'm a nurturer and that is my role, then treat me as that is equal to the man who's preaching on the pulpit. If we're saying that women are equal and we have children's workers and women's ministry, pay them the same as you pay the pastor preaching the gospel. And so even in our churches, even though women are said to be created equal and seen as equal, we know that they're not treated equally. And that is hard, and we've got to sit with that, because if we want change, this is the conversations we need to have. We have to have the hard conversations. We've got to get uncomfortable, and then we've got to go, how do we make this better?
And Nikki, just one thing, because there's going to be people who are going to hear this, and they're going to have a visceral negative reaction. And my prayer is, hold that space of a visceral negative reaction, and then create a platform where it can be aired out properly. So don't say, I don't want to be seen as a problem, and then hide the feelings. I'm having a negative reaction to everything that is being said here. Why? And then explore that, because as much as we're talking about the work that needs to be done to bring women in, I also think a very critical space is women are speaking up more. What are the men feeling? What are the men experiencing? And what space do they have to rumble with their emotions and everything that they need to work through? And that is something which I don't want us to miss in giving women a platform to speak, that we forget and say, the guys must just hear what we're saying, and they're not processing in their own safe space that they can work through. I feel like this when I hear this, and I don't like it. Okay, So how are your feelings measuring against what the Word of God says? How are your feelings measuring against where we're supposed to be taking this country, where we're supposed to be taking this church? Because I think the biggest challenge that we will have is people will watch this, people will be like, great, and then people will move on. And I think the beautiful thing that Unspoken gives us is, one, a space to have the awkward conversations, and then secondly, the hope that the awkward conversations are going to lead to more conversations so that we can start seeing a change. So my heartbreak would be to sit here and be vulnerable and share all these things that aren't necessarily very popular views, and then to find myself next year sitting and feeling the very same way, that a woman is not valued in the church, and for me to be fearful of what the future is going to look like for my 15-month-old. So there's very much what's happening with us in the present, but there's a very great awareness of what world am I going to leave my child with.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the reality of that, Fundi, is that if we have a greater understanding and outworking of that equality that God has given us and sees us with, that is a more full reflection of the gospel.
So I think we need to, first and foremost, when we are hearing the word of God saying, created as image bearers, when I say something profane, or when I am quiet when something wrong is happening, whether that woman is a Christian or not, that is an image bearer.
One last question before we wrap it up. And we're going to talk about men for a little bit. So, like for myself as a dad of two boys, as a father, and yeah, like I mentioned to you earlier, like you think that you're doing enough, you think you're teaching your boys how to, respect one another, respect their mother, how to deal with things. And like I'm also try to put in some time mentoring younger men, and then like I think to myself, I'm doing some things, I'm contributing. But then the problem is so vast that you look at yourself again and what you're contributing as it's not enough. So what more, or what can we do as men, like, and Christian or non-Christian men, what can we do to help make change,
Can I just affirm just the first bit that Nikki said, and then the ladies will jump in. It takes one person to change and create a revolution. So one, I do not want to undermine the work that you're doing and the work that other men are doing. Having men growing up with positive role models, we then hope that those men will be different in the future. So that in and of itself changes and can touch so many people in different ways. So first and foremost, being actively engaged, one, in your own family, if you have a family that is yours in terms of wife, children, or with kids in your community. That is nothing small. I just want to just affirm that that is in and of itself big enough, because there aren't enough men in our communities doing that.
Yeah. And I was going to say that, I was actually going to say that, as I said before, it's that positive male role model that is healing for women, but also healing for men. I speak for myself saying that has been the most healing for me, is finding positive role models who are male in my life, be it my friends, be it my husband, for sure, my father-in-law. They've been such a healing process for me to go, I can trust men, they treat me equally, I can have this conversation. And so yes, I think it starts with you. I think it's starting with you as a male and going, where are my biases? How do I view women? Is that right? Talk to your wife, talk to your girlfriends, talk to females around, ask them about their experience as women, and try to understand where we're coming from. I think as a father, I think it's how you parent your boys, how you parent your girls, if you have girls, that it's okay to speak out when you're feeling uncomfortable. It's okay to talk. It's okay to be a confident woman, and for our boys to be okay to be nurturing, to be sensitive, to be who they are. You know, the best advice I've gotten as a parent is that God gave you this child to guide and mold. They don't belong to you, they belong to God. And so our responsibility is how are we guiding them as Christian parents in this world? Talk about your feelings as a male. I know my husband's probably going to laugh when and I know my friends are, but it is important, because once we are able to be emotionally literate, once we become self-aware to go, I'm feeling angry, I'm feeling like, and we all I feel that way. I have a bad temper. So I know I do the fist and I want to punch something, but it's talking to myself going, I'm feeling angry. Why am I feeling angry? How do I calm down? So it's that self-talk of how we talk to ourselves. And then it's that our self-esteem as women and as men. So I'm talking to men. How do you view yourself? How worthy do you feel? Who is your support structure around you? Who are your male role models in your life? And that is what we're missing as a country. And I see it. I see our boys looking for a sense of belonging, and that's why they're falling into gangsterism. That's why they're looking for drugs, for that healing, for that coping mechanism. I had a teenage boy the other day crawl into my lap and cry, and all he wanted was a relationship with his father. Sure. And that's what we need. And I know if we don't break that cycle, he's going to turn out like his dad, because there's no one else who's able to guide him. So he's going to end up in a gang and a prison if we don't get him now. And so when you go, what can I do? It's so overwhelming. It starts with you. It starts with you, and start having that conversation with yourself.
And if I can affirm what Danny's saying, so my boys are not little. My oldest is 20 and my youngest is 14. And so we've walked that young journey when you have quite a lot of control over the input that you have in your children's lives. And when they get to high school, that changes, that dynamic changes, and the world speaks quite powerfully and uncomfortably into our children's lives. And so I think we need to acknowledge that in this conversation with role models, in not just in Danny's situation, but in my situation, for example. And so that role that you play with your sons changes, but it never stops. So, and I want to encourage families at St. James to have these uncomfortable conversations with one another, that men would be having those conversations when you're having a meal together with your son. So we have these amazing conversations also with your friend Philip Van Bloek, and that's the kind of relationship we've built over time, where we have uncomfortable conversations with one another, and now the next generation are old enough, they're also having those conversations. And sometimes they're uncomfortable and horrible, and sometimes we rant and rave and disagree, and that's okay, because part of this is acknowledging that this is messy, and it's not a tick box. We can't just say, oh, we've got it right and we've ticked it as Christians and now we move on. This is life. This is life in South Africa. It's messy, it's uncomfortable, but my hope is that we kind of allow that space for these, the reality of how it plays out for dads and their sons, or whatever the situation may be.
I think for me, it would be to accept the gift of imperfection. I think sometimes we're just so hard on ourselves to get things right and to be perceived in a particular way. But if you're starting something new, you're going to fumble. My daughter's 16 months now, and she's been learning how to walk. She crawled, she's perfecting feeding herself, and I have to be comfortable with, she's going to make a mess. I'm going to have to clean it up, but she must learn how to feed herself properly. And I think we don't do that with ourselves, to say, okay, there's a lot of things that are happening that are new to me. I maybe wasn't raised in this particular manner, but I want to raise my kids differently. And then to know that you're going to fumble. You're going to make mistakes. It's not going to be pretty, but you're at least doing something. And hopefully you can then look back 10 years because you've started and say, the relationship is different. My boys are behaving in a manner that is fitting, or the guys that I'm mentoring are behaving in a particular manner, or my conversations with my brothers are different. The way we're speaking about women, the way I look at women, when I see a guy doing something and I see just a look in a woman's face that she's uncomfortable, I'm emboldened to speak, whereas 2 years ago I wouldn't have done that. But it starts with embracing imperfection. It's okay, you don't have to get it right, but just start.
Yeah. Take action.
100%.
And our kids, you know, they don't, as much as we'd like, they don't listen to what we say. They mimic what we do. And so this is what's scary as being as a parent, is that your kids watch every little thing you do. And so how you interact with women, how you talk about women, that's how they pick it up. And so we can break the cycle there. And in terms of our country, South Africa, another controversial thing, but I have to say it because I believe it, is that as parents, we need to find a way of doing positive discipline and gentle parenting, because punitive discipline, and we have to go, what is discipline? Discipline is teaching. So how do you make those behavioral problems, which we know gets on our nerves and not great, how do we make that a teachable moment, that we're not going into corporal punishment? Because again, it starts a cycle of violence. And we need to speak to that as parents. And I know I've had a backlash doing that, but working in the communities that I do and looking at myself and my past and what I've experienced, and talking with my husband, that is something that we are having that conversation going, is corporal punishment is not going to help our children understand the behavior that we see is unacceptable. So how do we find other ways? And there's wonderful resources for our parents to go look at and go, how do we connect with our children? How do we build a positive relationship? But how do we discipline in a positive and gentle way? We don't have to hit to discipline our children.
I'm going to stop it there. Thank you so much. It's been a great learning experience for me. And thank you for watching. If you'd like to reach out to us with a comment or question, please email us to unspoken@madlittlebadger.com.